I guess we're still in the morning. Good morning. My name is Ian Brzenzinski. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council with the Brent Scowcroft Center. And I have the privilege of hosting our luncheon conversation, the United States and the United States' future role in European security. And I'm going to be a little bit abbreviated because, unfortunately, our guest of honor, Derek Chollet, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, has a hard departure at 12:15. So I'm going to keep my questions a little bit to the point so I can save some time for you all. And I'll also be very brief in my introduction of Derek. He, as I said, is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, where he's responsible for U.S. defense strategy regarding issues related to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He has brought great experience to that post, having served as Special Assistant to the President on the NSC for Strategic Planning, the Deputy Director for Policy Planning at State. He was a key member of the Obama-Biden transition team, so he's been with the administration from the start. He served in the Clinton administration as a speechwriter for Ambassador to the UN Holbrooke and as Special Advisor to Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. And one thing I particularly value in his background is he spent time on the Hill working for Senator John Edwards. And just on an interesting personal note, he's quite an accomplished research analyst and writer, having written 6 of his own books. But to reflect on his bipartisan background, he contributed significantly to the memoirs of Secretaries of State James Baker and Warren Christopher, but also to some of his mentors, Ambassador Holbrooke in his book on the Dayton peace process, and Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot's book on U.S.-Russian relations. Now, this morning, we had an overview of kind of the context in which our conversation is occurring. This is an alliance. We have a transatlantic security relationship in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increasingly assertive Russian conduct elsewhere in Eurasia. Derek's joining us just weeks after 2 important speeches by President Obama, one at West Point, where we rolled out or added nuance to his vision of how and when U.S. military force should be used, and the President's recent visit to Europe, where in Warsaw he gave an important speech that touched on U.S. commitment to European security. And since then, we've had the outbreak of ISIS in Iraq, the continuing turmoil in Syria, and looking forward, we have the NATO Summit in Wales. And of course, this morning, I guess our time, NATO foreign ministers met to address that agenda. So Derek, let me start off by looking at some of these speeches that President Obama recently delivered. And I'm struck by probably the most important one, which is the one in West Point, in which he discussed where and how U.S. forces should be used. And he talked about U.S. military force being used primarily for the defense of our vital interests and those of our allies. And for other situations, he talked about the requirement to utilize that force multilaterally in cooperation with other nations. How do you think that would resonate in a country like Ukraine and Europe? It probably was reassuring to Poles, to Balts, to Romanians, where they saw allies resting assured on a commitment to American military force. But at a time when a country like Ukraine is being invaded by Russia, is a partner, and doesn't seem to fall in that first category of use of force, it must have been a little bit disturbing. And maybe it could have been seen as a little bit of a green light by the folks that surround Putin and Putin himself. How do you react to that?
Well, thanks, Ian, for the question. But before I get to the answer, I just want to thank everyone for being here. It's a great privilege for me to be with Fred and friends like Damon and Barry Pavel. This is a fantastic new facility. This is the first time I've been here. And my only regret is that I'm only here for a short bit of time. My hard stop is because I have to go to Capitol Hill to testify on Libya. So believe me, I'd much prefer to elongate my time here, but I think Elena Ross-Layton would not be happy with me. So that's why I have to leave early. And I also want to congratulate you on the report that you're launching with this conference. I had a chance to skim it last night. And I have to say, both analytically and also in terms of the prescriptive parts of it, I agree with about 99% of it. I thought it was a terrific report, very cogent, very relevant, obviously, and very helpful to someone like myself. In terms of the question, particularly in the West Point and how our friends, particularly in Ukraine, might have heard that speech. I happened to be in Ukraine just days after that speech was delivered to discuss with the Minister of Defense, the National Security Advisor, and other senior officials, ways that we can help them with their defense reform and to deal with the very disturbing events, of course, in their east. And, you know, the president has said from the outset when it comes to the situation in Ukraine that there's not a U.S. military solution, and that's why the president, the vice president, Secretary Kerry, have been very involved diplomatically with the Ukrainians. And part of the reason for my trip there and the timing of my trip, coming just days after the days before the inauguration of President Poroshenko, but days after his election, was to really dig into this conversation with them about ways that we can continue to help them on their defense needs. It was just later that week, of course, the president announced an additional $5 million in U.S. assistance for Ukrainians' military. That brings us to about $23 million total in assistance we'll be giving to Ukraine over the coming months. Now, a lot of that is going to be to address their immediate needs. So I think just today, 2,000 sets of body armor are going to be arriving in Ukraine. Those are badly needed. That was item number one on their agenda with me several weeks ago. But also things like medical kits, uniforms, sleeping mats. I mean, this is a military that's been deployed now for several months. It's in great need of supply, and it's depleted. So we're going to address those immediate needs. But also there's the medium to long-term challenges that they face. This is a military, although they've been 20 years independent, they've been a partner of NATO, they've operated with us in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a military that's in badly need of reform. I found the Ukrainian defense minister was quite candid with me about the need. Here we are still 20 years after their independence, but the need to move out of the Soviet-Russian orientation. And they need help from the United States and other NATO partners in terms of training and reform. And that's something that we're very committed to doing. It was right after my visit, we had sent a team of defense reform advisors to Ukraine to begin working with the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to talk to them about ways that they can do better planning, do better budgeting, be more professional. So we both have the urgent needs, but as well as the medium to long-term approach.
But when are we going to move to kind of some of the assistance that Ukrainians have been asking since your visit, lethal military assistance, anti-tank weapons, surface-to-air missiles, to allow them to operate more effectively with a little bit more lethal force, particularly in Luhansk and Donetsk?
Yeah, so that's something they are asking for that. We're talking it through with them. They are prioritizing their needs in terms of the urgent priorities along the lines of, again, initially, several months ago, was MREs. Now the body armor was very urgent. The border guards are in great need of support. When I was in Ukraine, I had an opportunity to meet with the head of the border guards, and these are border guards who were oriented to the west for many years, and now they're worried about the east, which is it's almost a non-border in many instances. It's not even demarcated in some places. So they need communications equipment, they need night vision goggles, and I think the lethal conversation is something that we'll get to eventually, but it's not the thing that's foremost on our minds.
What about military exercises in Ukraine? I was struck by the fact that a major Allied exercise was supposed to occur in the Odessa region was indefinitely postponed. Doesn't that send the wrong message to Russia?
Well,
doesn't send a disconcerting Russian message to the Ukrainians?
So I think the Ukrainians have participated in military exercises in the past. We've had military exercises on their soil in the past. The decision to delay was a mutual decision in part because right now the Ukrainian military is pretty busy. And they're in short supply of bandwidth, and so continuing exercises with Ukraine is something we are very committed to. I think NATO should be committed to. It's part of what the funding that the president announced as part of his trip, this $1 billion European Reassurance Initiative. Part of that money will go to things like additional exercises with countries like Ukraine.
Let's talk a little bit about the European Reassurance Initiative the president rolled out in Warsaw. It's a $1 billion initiative. One of the concerns I have is that it could be spread real thin, real fast. Much of it's dedicated to ongoing operations or exercises. You're talking about a vast realm from the Baltic Sea all the way down the Black and Adriatic Seas. What are some of the principles that are guiding your planning for that? And when are we going to see this initiative mature into actual tangible actions or deployments or infrastructure in the region?
Well, hopefully soon, you'll be seeing more detail on the European Reassurance Initiative. It was just announced several weeks ago. As you can imagine, and you know well from your experience at the Pentagon, it has consumed, I dare say, thousands of man and woman hours since the announcement to try to fill out what this $1 billion is going to be used for. It's a challenge, but it's also a happy challenge. As you know, in the Pentagon recently, we've been going through a different kind of exercise of finding ways we're going to do as much with less. And putting new money, new resources towards some of these important efforts, whether it be further exercises, whether it be some infrastructure projects in partner countries, whether it be ways that we can continue to augment and keep up the op-tempo of our own presence in Europe. That's what this $1 billion will be for. We're going to be going to Congress really in the coming days with a more detailed proposal, and we will look for congressional support. It's something, frankly, we're going to need the help of folks in this room for as well, because we will engage in that discussion with the Congress, but there'll be many questions for members of Congress, as I get when I appear before Congress on these issues, who ask, well, why should the United States spend an extra $1 billion on European reform or on European defense when European defense budgets are continuing to decline? Why should the American people continue to subsidize the security of Europe? Well, I believe strongly that it's in our national security interest to do so, but it won't be necessarily an easy argument to make with the Congress, so we'll need the help of everyone.
What is the end state you're aiming for, or the President is aiming for in this initiative? Does it include something more than exercises that it could end, presence that could end? Are you aiming for the creation of an enduring, institutionalized, strategically significant presence, perhaps in North Central Europe, the Baltics, Poland? We already have a base, a forward operating base in Bulgaria and Romania. Mm-hmm. And I really emphasize the word enduring, mm-hmm. because people don't like to use the word permanent.
Right.
But enduring is something that will last for decades, in my view.
Yeah, fair enough. I think that's all on the table. It's important to note this is one sort of 1 year money. This is not going to be $1 billion for all of eternity. This is just a one-time ask. It's a contingency fund. And I think some of what we'll seek to do in the near term are things that will be finite, things like exercises. But I do envision things along the lines of building up infrastructure to enable countries to host rotational forces through. Permanent presence is not something we're actively thinking about with this fund. I think persistent presence, maybe it's just another euphemism, but things where, or like what we've done in Poland over the last 2 years with the aviation detachment, which is a small number of permanent U.S. Men and women, about I think 11 airmen in Poland, but that then enable us to rotate through substantial assets for exercises and presence there in Poland. So I think that's to us is a very positive model that we can use and seek to replicate across Europe.
Are you expecting any European matching funds in this effort? Could you see this evolving into something that's not just a unilateral American initiative demonstrating commitment to the alliance, but could it be complemented by European contributions in Central Europe, perhaps also to an enduring presence?
Yes.
Could it evolve into a deliverable at the NATO Summit?
Yes, yes, and yes. We, when the President announced this initiative during his trip, it was the same week that I was with Secretary Hagel at a NATO Defense Ministerial in Brussels. And for those of you who experienced NATO Defense Ministerials, you can appreciate this, but it gave us a good talking point to use. Where, the analogy I would say is we've just signed up to bring the main dish to the picnic, and we're looking for other folks around the table at the NAC to say, well, what are you bringing to the picnic? And the United States was saying, we've got $1 billion here that we're showing we're going to commit to this very important effort. And for many of those, this is difficult for the President, by the way. This is not something that politically is necessarily going to be popular here in the United States. So, but we're showing our commitment, and it's trying to lead by example. And some of our European friends took note. The Poles, of course, the same week of the ministerial and the President's visit, announced their commitment to increase their defense spending. Other countries, Latvia, Lithuania, have come online to say they're going to get over 2%. For the summit. And I think the summit is an opportunity for all of us, for the alliance, for not just countries like the United States, but all NATO allies, all of us, to come together and show that we are prepared to do what it takes spend the resources that are necessary for our common security.
You know, when the president was in Warsaw, he also rolled out the U.S.-Poland Solidarity and Partnership Initiatives, something which has your fingerprints all over it. Can you tell us what are going to be the key elements of this initiative? What areas are you focusing on? What will come of it and when?
Well, we are actively working on that. In fact, our friend Robert Kupiecki is due in Washington shortly to really dig into the conversations with myself and my colleagues about filling that out in more detail. And I think that a lot of what we've discussed already that it's in this European Reassurance Initiative, things like that, but Poland specific is what we're thinking about. Ways that we can have a robust exercise program, continuing to leverage things like the aviation detachment to continue to deepen our relationship with Poland and to continue to develop Poland's own defense capabilities, which are considerable. So I think things like that are what's on the table. But what's very important, and I feel strongly about, is we want to have a roadmap for the future, particularly given how day-to-day these things can seem, particularly over the last several months in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. But have a roadmap that shows our mutual commitment to one another moving forward and has enough specificity to be able to hold ourselves accountable for what we're committing to do.
Poland, of course, has a major modernization program, and one of the centerpieces is the development of its own air and missile defense capability. Do you see air and missile defense capability being part of this initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. As you know, Poland is right now in the middle of their process to think about make some important decisions on air and defense capability, and that's something we talk with the Poles about quite a bit. When Secretary Hagel was in Warsaw in January of this past year, their modernization generally, and specifically the missile defense effort was a central topic. So that will certainly be one of the pillars of our strategy moving forward.
Then stepping back on kind of European-wide missile defense in light of in the context of the Ukraine crisis, there has been some talk or hints from some administration officials there could be possible acceleration of EPAA. Is that in the works?
I think EPAA is moving forward apace. We're scheduled to have the Aegis Ashore online in 2015 and the Poland piece of it in 2018. Ships are in Rota right now. So I think I don't anticipate acceleration, but I think we're deeply committed to sticking to the program, and that's something we make sure we make very clear whenever we're talking to our friends and partners in the region.
And how has the evolution of Russian policy, its changing force structure, the invasion of Ukraine, how is that affecting U.S. defense relations with countries like Azerbaijan and Georgia?
Mm-hmm. Well, we have very close defense relations with Azerbaijan and Georgia, of course. And Georgia in particular is a terrific partner, a partner that's been in the fight with us in Iraq, it's in the fight with us in Afghanistan, and has committed to be a major part of the train, advise, and assist mission in Afghanistan post-2014. And we're very interested in developing even deeper relations with both Georgia and Azerbaijan on the defense side. I think one of the challenges we all face collectively, not just the United States, but the entire alliance is grappling with, is this new kind of warfare that Russia is waging right now, and we're seeing in Ukraine. It's whether you call it irregular or asymmetric or indirect, activities that still today we're seeing where weaponry is appearing on one side is on the Russian side of the border that then is mysteriously appearing on the Ukrainian side of the border, and how the alliance grapples with that, where it's a challenge that's not black and white, where it's forces crossing a border, but it's nevertheless deeply destabilizing and absolutely and directly a problem for us and an assault on our interests. How we deal with that, where there's enough ambiguity that would mean a collective response, sometimes will be difficult because it will, there'll be certain allies who will say, well, there's no clear proof. That's a challenge for us, and it's one that our military is thinking a lot about. General Breedlove at the Defense Ministerial a few weeks ago gave a very good presentation on this new development and how we ought to be thinking about it. I think this is something leaders will have to take up at the summit, but I see this as a big work project for the alliance really over the coming years.
Let me push you a little bit on Georgia and Azerbaijan. I mean, has there been a change in the tempo of our defense relationship with Georgia and Azerbaijan since February 26th?
No.
Or is it more of the same?
Yeah, well, it's pretty intense already. We of course, again, with Georgia, because we're operating with them, it's very intense. And there are things that they're interested in, of course, that we're working through. And I think one of the announcements today at the NATO Foreign Ministerial was NATO working with Georgia on what Rasmussen called a substantial package of support for them in terms of deepening the relationship between now and the time of the summit. Since that was just announced today, I don't have the details of what that exactly means. But I think the U.S. In particular, but the alliance generally, I think, has signaled that it's interested in working more with Georgia, even as this map issue unfolds.
Before I open it up, let me ask kind of the big forward-looking question here in the Atlantic Council, which is, what are your expectations for the Wales Summit, the NATO Wales Summit? What are the core themes or priorities that are driving your initiatives in the NATO channels to prepare for a summit that will be one that will be addressing current challenges and threats, but also preparing it, of course, for the more asymmetric, diversified challenges that the alliance has to be prepared for if it's going to be relevant in the future?
Absolutely. I think this is a very important summit. All summits are important, but this one feels particularly so because of the moment we're in right now as an alliance. Given the confluence of Afghanistan and the post-2014 transition in Afghanistan, the fact that we have, of course, Ukraine and the challenges with Russia, and the fact that the alliance as a whole is going through, is in a period of austerity. I think it's very important right now for the leaders to come together and give us all our guidance and our work plan moving forward. 6 months ago, those of us in the government already starting to think about the summit were worried that it was going to be very hard to get folks to pay much attention to it. I know the Atlantic Council will pay close attention to it, but outside of folks who care about European security and who do this professionally, I think because of the particularly events with Russia, there's going to be a lot of attention on the summit, and also this concern we had that some may be asking, what's the point of NATO? We don't need it anymore. Now, after almost 20 years of continuous operations, starting in the Balkans through today in Afghanistan, what's the point of the alliance? Well, I think that's going to be an easier sell right now from the leaders. That said, we still have some very difficult things we got to work through. First of all, obviously capabilities, and ensuring that the alliance comes around a set of capabilities that are going to be relevant to the 21st century, being able to deal with things like this new kind of warfare Russia's waging, but also dealing with threats coming up from North Africa and the Middle East in particular. Interoperability, big challenge for the alliance because we've been in continuous operations now for almost 2 decades. We've learned a lot. We've developed a lot of strong muscle tissue in interoperability, and how we maintain that short of a war we're fighting together will be a challenge. That's where the exercise program in particular comes in. And then third, partnerships. One of the great accomplishments of this alliance since the mid-1990s was the development of the partnership program and the fact that we have 40 countries that are partners of NATO. And many of those countries, Georgia, for example, Australia is another, have been contributing more than most NATO allies when it comes to a place like Afghanistan in particular. And so how we maintain this partnership agenda and have it continue to evolve and benefit the alliance. So it's not just at the core of 28, but it's the 28 plus, depending on whatever the situation is a big challenge for us moving forward.
Let me push you a little bit on that, and use a moderator's prerogative here. From briefings I've heard from NATO officials and discussions and from other administration officials, I have the sense that the alliance's agenda for the summit is still somewhat lost. At best, it's stuck back in November of last year, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They're talking about post-Afghanistan NATO. They're talking about smart defense, the endless 2% issue, interconnected forces initiative, collective defense, partnerships. The fact of the matter is the alliance is occurring in the most major crisis in the last 25 years, an invasion of a European country, Ukraine. Reassuring the East, reassuring the countries along NATO's eastern frontier, strikes me as the most important priority. And if that isn't front and center the priority, NATO is going to look like it has its head in the sand, avoiding reality. And moreover, it won't be directly addressing what's most important right now, which is preventing that instability, that invasion from the east, bringing to NATO's borders occupation, confrontation, instability, if not insurrection. That ought to be the focus. Then behind that becomes collective defense, which is what the alliance has been focusing on, and then partnerships, all wrapped up in the transatlantic bow of the transatlantic bargain, so to speak, which the administration has taken a first step in saying, hey, with our $1 billion initiative, you need to match it. Are those the wrong priorities?
No, but I don't think they're different necessarily. I think that I see them supporting one another. I mean, clearly reassurance, both for the NATO members who are frontline states, but also the partners, in particular, who are in the Russia context, that's going to be a key part of the summit. And by then, we'll obviously have a lot more detail on our $1 billion contribution to that effort. And hopefully, we will have hustled up some allies to show something as well when it comes to reassurance. But also, I mean, if we were having the summit today, we'd also be talking a lot about what's going on in the Middle East. I spend a lot of my time on the Middle East, and depending on where Iraq goes, or if you talk to some of our southern NATO partners, they're very interested in talking about what I'm about to go testify on, Libya, and the challenges both in terms of migration, but also the threat stream coming up from the south, and they don't want us to forget what's going on in North Africa. So that's why I think it's a great time to have a summit, because if we didn't have NATO, we'd have to invent it. And whether it's the East, whether it's the South, or whether it's the challenges within the alliance in terms of spending capabilities and whatnot, we have to come together and sort of chart a way forward. It's the right time to do it.
Great. Let me open it up to folks. Ambassador.
Hi, Bat Kutelia, McCain Institute. I'm from Georgia. My question is on enlargement. In Chicago summit, Secretary Hillary Clinton mentioned that she hoped that next summit would be an enlargement summit. Well, clearly we are not navigating toward this, as it seems now. While every stage of enlargement was a mixture of two types of factors, geopolitical urgency or political feasibility, and technical or political interoperability. And with different success, it proved to be good decisions. So my question is for the upcoming or in the future enlargement, what are the ratio of these two considerations of the political urgency or geopolitical urgency and technical interoperability or performance? Thank you.
Well, I think they're both important, and specifically on the case of Georgia, as you know, the U.S. supports Georgia's getting a membership action plan. It's an alliance of 28. We have other partners, other influential partners, who've been very clear and very public about their reluctance to take that step. That's why I thought it was positive today. The Secretary General, in his press conference that I just saw as I was coming here, said some very positive things about Georgia, and made a commitment as an alliance for us to move forward on a substantial package with Georgia. I think that's important to do, because I've never ceased to be impressed with Georgia as a partner, a defense partner of the United States in particular. So I think whether it comes to operational issues or the political impetus, I think they're both very important.
Does the United States support an invitation to Montenegro?
So we've had very long and detailed discussions with the Montenegrins. They've had some issues they've had to overcome, and to their credit, they're making progress along those lines. What NATO announced as part of the ministerial wrap-up today was that they would deepen consultations with the Montenegrins and hope to have an answer by the end of 2015. So it would not be a summit issue, but to have a more specific way forward for Montenegro in the next year or so. So we are. I think Montenegro is it's a place that's made a lot of progress. It's had some challenges, as you know. They have very good leadership right now. Their defense minister, who I know has come through town and been here several times, is a great advocate for them, and she gave Secretary Hagel the same version I think she gave here in terms of making the case. But I don't think they're quite there yet.
Fred Kemp, President.
Derek, thanks so much for doing this. We know how busy you are, so I really appreciate it. I wonder if you could, since you're dealing with the Middle East as well, drill down a little bit deeper on that. Brent Scowcroft earlier today talked about the Mideast. Forget about non-state actors. He said the Mideast is becoming a non-state region, and talked about the dissolution of countries that seems to be taking place. Do you see it as that historically dramatic, what we're watching right there? And if so, how does one guide a policy in the current sort of Iraq situation around that set of issues?
Yeah.
And since we're talking about NATO, one of the criticisms in this conference has been we're not really using NATO as a place to talk strategically about these sorts of issues before we actually get involved in something, and one is almost afraid to. So do we need more strategic discussion transatlantically also about these sorts of issues just for political reasons?
Yes, absolutely. I think Secretary Kerry today used the opportunity of being at NATO and coming off his visit to Iraq to brief his fellow ministers on his trip and have a discussion with them on the way forward. I think that's something the United States would be very interested in doing. I think some of our European partners would be worried that bringing those kinds of issues more actively into the NATO context would either dilute some of the things that they are more concerned by, or perhaps in some cases put them in a position of expectations being risen on what they may do about it, to be honest. In terms of what's going on in the Middle East, generally I do see it as one of these uniquely historical moments. I mean, this is the chessboard is being rearranged in a way that it's hard to really fathom the depth of what's happening. I mean, the Iraq problem is to me not really an Iraq problem, it's an ISIS problem, and its borders are mattering less between Syria and Iraq for sure, but even we're seeing concerns about the Jordanian and the Iraqi border as well. And I think that's how we have to sort of try to look at this, is not just state-by-state answers, but it's got to be a regional answer. And you could expand it out if you just want to make yourself feel worse. It's not just a Syria, Iraq, Lebanon issue. It's, stretch out the arc of instability really from Mali through Libya, Egypt, Sinai, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran. If you want to make it real fun, go Afghanistan, Pakistan. I mean, that's a swath of territory. I think arc of crisis was coined 30 years ago by an esteemed former national security advisor. That if you look as these terrorist networks are getting traction and working more closely together, the tools we approach these problems with as a government, which are state-centric, oftentimes fall short of the problem. So it's an immense challenge. It's a generational challenge. It's one that's going to outlast the time that this administration's in office. I think absolutely it's an issue that we're going to need our transatlantic partners' support and active work on.
I'm going to throw out the last question. We have one more question.
Yeah.
Damon?
I'll be quick. Thanks again, Derek, for doing this. Just a real quick question about deterrence and Putin. We failed in 2008 to clearly deter Putin from considering further aggression in the East. We see this back and forth in Ukraine right now. Do you expect that the alliance will are we able to have a sense of strategic deterrence for Putin in the future? Or are we headed for a period of perhaps years of degree of instability, tensions, and conflict on the alliance's eastern flank?
It's a good question. Trying to figure out ways to influence Putin is something many of us have puzzled over for many years now. And I do think that we've shown, in particular in the last 3 months, that the alliance is capable of deterrence. I mean, I think Putin definitely got the message, not just by our actions, but the actions of other partners to in particular reassure the Balts and the Poles, the Romanians, that there was a line that could not be crossed. And I think that, although we've been criticized by some on the sanctions as not being tough enough, I think that they have hurt Russia. I think that they've certainly gotten Putin's attention. So I think that although we're never probably going to be in a place where we're fully satisfied of the level of deterrence we have, in part because of the asymmetric and irregular way that Russia is going about destabilizing some of its neighboring states. I think that we've shown that we're able to change our behavior that sends the message to Russia that there is a line that cannot be crossed.
How is this affecting our planning posture towards Russia? Every planning document that's come out in your administration, previous administration, has about a time span about 5 minutes, and it becomes irrelevant. Mm-hmm. The QDR came out and had a very positive picture of the relationship with Russia. Mm-hmm. If that were to be rewritten today, would it be different? Are you making planning assumptions on the hope that Russia will be a partner, or are you, for lack of better words, digging in and preparing for a longer-term adversarial relationship driven by Putin rather than us, but nonetheless adversarial?
Yeah, I think I would quibble a little bit with the characterization that the QDR said it was a positive relationship. And I think we've been pretty sober about, particularly from a military perspective, pretty sober about the potential of the relationship with Russia over the past several years. In particular, since Putin has formally ascended the leadership again in Russia. I don't think the QDR, what's happened is not going to lead to some sort of major rethink of our overall strategy. I think a lot of the basic thrust of our strategy, whether it's building partnership capacity, whether it's continuing to have rotational presence in Europe, whether it's building up certain particular capabilities, whether it's ISR, maritime, cyber. Those are things that are all very relevant to the new challenge we're facing from Russia. We don't see Russia as an adversary. Often get that question: is Russia the new enemy? But I think it's clear that Russia is not a partner right now, and even though NATO doesn't see Russia as an adversary, it's clear Russia sees NATO as an adversary. And so many of the assumptions that we all have been working under really since the early 1990s, when we first were talking about enlargement, are being rethought. And although things like the Founding Act are not on the table right now for rethinking, it's clear Russia's not living up to its end of the Founding Act. So I think that's going to be a conversation that certainly leaders will take up at the summit, and that we're going to be grappling with for months to come.
Well, Derek, thank you very much. You've been kind with your time. We promised to get you out here a quarter after. We're a little bit beyond that. You've been very gracious in terms of elaborating on the president's speeches, talking about the upcoming summit and some of the kind of challenges we're facing in Europe and to the South. So thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks, I appreciate it.